Okay, welcome everyone. Advocacy 101, state budget updates. We're glad you all took time out of your afternoon to hear some of these important state budget updates for the early education and care field. And you're going to hear some comments from myself, Titus DosRemedios. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at Strategies for Children, as well as Charlie Stefanini, who is my colleague and our legislative strategist. And then we'll turn it over to Colin Jones from the Mass Budget and Policy Center. State budget review, I think, will be important just to give you all a little lay of the land of how the state budget was faring before COVID-19 hit. And then Charlie will talk about some legislative actions since March. And Colin will get into more detail around the state revenue picture and what FY21 is shaping up to be. The state fiscal year, remember, ends, 1 year ends at the end of June and the other fiscal year begins July 1st. So we're approaching a transition from fiscal year 2020 to fiscal year 2021. And then we'll close with some next steps for advocacy. Here's a great photo. The last time we were all together in a room, many of you were there. Advocacy Day at the State House, March 5th, 2020. You know, this was more than 300 early educators from across the state gathered together. The biggest advocacy day we've had. Legislators were on hand. Commissioner Sam was on hand. A parent spoke to share her story. All good stuff, and all sort of continuing the momentum and energy for early education and care in our state. Really since FY 13 or 14, right around the low point of the recession, there have been slow and steady increases for early education up until the past couple of months when the COVID-19 crisis came to us all. These numbers are not adjusted for inflation, Colin, so I apologize in advance. The governor issued his proposal for fiscal year 2021 back in January, and this budget would have continued an 8th consecutive year of increases for early education. There were major investments in childcare access proposed, a rate increase of $10 million, a new sliding scale reserve of $10 million to help address parent fees. Many programs were level funded, but important to sustain those programs like Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative and Head Start. Then came this guy, COVID-19. And as you all know, the world hasn't really been the same since. In our world of early education and care, we've seen program closures mandated statewide as of March 18th. The state and EEC continuing to pay subsidies and parent fees through the closure. Exempt emergency childcare has opened. There are 500 plus providers serving the children of essential workers all across the state. There have been some pieces of federal aid, but not nearly enough. And we know that the loss of private pay is a huge loss for the market, and it's making you know, programs nervous about the financial viability of continuing. There is a reopening plan. It is in development. There are recommendations from many different groups. Commissioner Sam presented yesterday to our state's reopening advisory board, Strategies for Children, and many others. 38 organizations signed a sign-on letter to the Reopening Advisory Board, prioritizing childcare and health and safety, and a thoughtful plan for reopening the economy aligned with the needs of childcare. Charlie, we'd like to hear from you now. What are some of the updates from the State House?
Sure. Thank you, Titus. And it's great to be here. And thanks to everybody for being on the call. Titus has got me on a tight time frame, so I'm gonna put on my little stopwatch here. So I'm just gonna spend a couple slides in a few minutes just talking real quick a perspective of the legislature and a legislator in this environment. Obviously, uncertainty sort of rules the day. I know that sounds cliche, but with the status of the economy, the uncertainty of the future of the virus, and the uncertainty of the legislative process right now, time-wise, there's more questions than there are answers. It was funny to see Titus's slide of March 5th with 300 people in Great Hall advocating for early education and care, because on March 10th, an email went around saying, until further notice, there are no more advocacy days on the Hill, group gatherings, committee hearings. We're going to keep the State House open, but there's no more of those types of events until further notice. And since then, it's just been one chain of event after another. From a legislator's perspective, they have seen unprecedented constituent demand over the last 8 weeks, whether it's a constituent who lost their job and needs to navigate the unemployment insurance system, a small business is trying to figure out, can I ever reopen, stay alive? What do I do about my employees? Am I ever going to be able to reopen or keep this thing I built going? Food insecurity, roughly 9% of Massachusetts residents before COVID-19 identified as food insecure. That number is upwards of near or upper over 40%, depending on the part of the state that they're in. And if a legislator has a hospital or nursing home or health facility in their district, the demand on PPE and supplies and equipment is really been tremendous. So the constituent demand on legislators has been tremendous. I'd kind of look at the process-wise. A tremendous amount of work went into sort of preparing for the peak or the surge, whether that was bed capacity, ventilators, the beds that were set up for overflow, having enough equipment and masks and PPE. It looks as though, knock on wood, we've gotten on the other side of that, and it's now sort of managing the new set of circumstances that we were in front of. A number of things the legislature has done. I just want to tack them off real quick. Even before we went into our shelter at home situation, they had passed a $15 million bill for Department of Public Health and Health and Human Services to begin to tackle the coronavirus. The first unemployment insurance bill was passed very early on, which allowed eliminated the waiver or waiting period for unemployment insurance benefits. There's another bill that's moving through the legislature on unemployment insurance now. They did a bill for municipalities that were trying to deal with, folks that don't have the money to pay their property taxes this spring. Town meeting, budgeting processes. They passed a foreclosure and an eviction protection piece of legislation. Liability protection for healthcare workers who are moving from one healthcare setting or unit or floor to another. Digitizing the notary system, a public health reporting bill, and they are finishing up work on a borrowing bill to allow government to continue to take on some of the COVID-related issues. There have been almost 125 bills that have been filed specifically to address issues around coronavirus and COVID. Next slide. I think there's one more. Is it one more? All right. So last slide here. In the legislative process, we've moved to virtual committee hearings on those 125 bills. A number of the things that I talked about were passed in what's called informal session, which means that there's no formal counted roll call. The House and Senate are and have taken measures to move to formal roll call sessions now. Colin is going to talk about the budget process and where we are, but the timeline for the budget process and the remainder of the legislative session, sort of everything is on the table as we head into the remainder of the session. And just as a elected official, how you campaign as you go into a fall election cycle has obviously been turned on its side.
Charlie, we have one quick question here. What will be included in the unemployment insurance number 2? Do you know?
Yeah, so the second piece is to mainly to ensure that employers, that this crisis is not counted against employers in what's called the rating system. So when employers pay into unemployment insurance, it's based on the pro forma of their workforce. These are obviously unprecedented circumstances, so this would not impact a business or an employer negatively the rating that they would take. It's been passed by the Senate. The House has done a version. I think it's pending final approval.
Great, thank you. And now we are going to turn it over to Colin Jones, the Senior Policy Analyst for Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. If you have additional questions, you can keep putting them in the chat. We will have Colin present for a good stretch, and then we'll take some questions. But feel free to use the Q&A rather, which is slightly better than the chat, more functionality there. And take it away, Colin.
All right, thanks. Let me share screen. Okay, so thanks to Charlie. I'm going to try to also stay on time to go no more than 15 to 20 minutes. There is a lot to cover. And just to get right off the top, let me say I am coming to you from the command center in my toddler's playroom. So you'll see space stickers on the side and everything. But I'm very excited to let you guys know what we know so far about the budget picture for 2021. So I'm going to go over kind of where we see things right now, what are some of the things to keep in mind. And it is a very, very challenging situation. So I'm going to start with kind of the more on the challenge side, and then we'll talk about what opportunities are available to sort of get us out of a potential trouble. So, Charlie talked about a lot of this, but, we've had over 750,000 people file for unemployment in the last 5 weeks. And if you add sort of the special unemployment program, that goes to nearly 1 million. And as we talked about before, as this health crisis and now recession has taken hold, the demand for services and support is just going to keep going up and up. And just like with any other recession, I mean, this is a unique recession in terms of, the economy. If you go back, 6 months, we were looking at, a really strong economy, and how quickly it has gone down is pretty unprecedented. But according to the Federal Reserve, and a model they've been running, we are looking at the potential of revenue losses to the state budget of around $4 billion for fiscal year 2020, which is what we're in right now. And then, again, this is a range determined depending on how things go, but between 4 and 7 billion for fiscal year 2021. And so that's data from the Fed, where we're looking at, well, what are the optimistic scenarios? What are the more pessimistic scenarios? And that was from a couple of weeks ago. So I think that it is a rapidly evolving situation that analysts like us at Mass Budget and the Fed and a number of other organizations are doing our best to kind of keep track of the ups and downs of what's happening. So given this, I mean, this is, certainly exceeding what happened in 2008 and is looking more like, historically like a Great Depression level of disruption. So we have to really use all the tools in the toolbox. And that includes the state's rainy day fund, which is really our savings account for our state, which is now at about $3.5 billion. That's something we're going to have to use. It's a good thing that we've been, the legislature across the board has been adding to the rainy day fund throughout the good times in the economy, just for this type of situation. And then, but even more critical piece of this is we have to look to the federal government to step in, because the federal government can run a deficit and spend during a recession, and that's exactly what they need to do now. So, this is rapidly evolving. So as we speak, House Democratic leadership released a bill. I've been working on it, and I think it's done today. Sometimes known as CARES 2, or also HEROES, which is the next round of relief. And so we have to kind of see how that goes. It obviously has to get through both the House and Senate, and then be signed by the president before we move forward. So it's early in that process, but it's definitely the case that we need to continue to look to the feds and what they're doing. There's also at the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank, there's a program in place now to help states and local governments. It's really a short-term borrowing facility where the Fed will kind of lend to cities and states in the short term. And I think it's about $500 billion, I think is roughly the range of that. which it's good. It sounds like a lot, but there's also challenges with like pretty much all states, Massachusetts can't run a deficit. So we have to look at the sort of legal framework to figure out how we can use this particular program, because we might not be able to carry debt from year to year. So that's something to keep an eye on, though. The other big tool is, we've got to look at what revenue is available here in our state. And then we also have to keep in mind that, even as we're facing all these budget challenges, there are all the needs across health and employment protection and childcare and all the other things that we need right now. So we can't allow the situation to, grind everything to a halt. So the normal budget process, which is looks familiar and comforting right now, we are not in that anymore. But typically, again, we had our governor's budget in January. April and May, the House and Senate do their version, and then we're running with the new budget by July 1st. So that simply just does not apply to the situation. The 21 budget process is unique and is unpredictable. So we're not going to necessarily follow most of the steps and processes that we would normally do, and that's just the reality we're in right now. So some of the things that they're thinking about on Beacon Hill. So they've got to vote on the budget while maintaining social distance and starting to learn remote voting. So there was, over the past couple of weeks, they were figuring out how do we do remote voting. It seems simple enough when it's something everyone agrees on, but what if you have a more contentious thing in the budget and everyone's trying to get their priorities in there? That's going to be a little bit tougher. So they're figuring out remote voting, how to do it. And they're figuring out how to keep themselves safe, because there have been a couple of cases within the State House, and they're trying to just make sure they're safe, first of all. We've pushed the tax filing deadline to July. And so that is altering the timeline of when revenue's coming in. And, it's sort of something that we have to look at. And with the revenue estimates changing a lot and moving from April filing to July, there's certain things we have to figure out. What is actually the economic downturn and what is just delaying this deadline that we usually build around. So if you look at this April compared to last April, it's like this huge negative number, but we have to figure out how much of that is just moving the filing deadline. As I mentioned, the federal relief is a big variable, and also not only what money's coming in, but what are the strings. So when we first looked at the biggest relief bill so far, called CARES, when Mass Budget and others were first looking at it, it looked more favorable. But when we looked at it in greater detail, we found that there was more strings attached to the money for the state budget than we thought there would be. And that really makes sense, because it limits the money more to directly responding to COVID-19. Whereas, it's not as if, COVID-19 is targeting the revenue that supports health. It's obviously the whole budget revenue support is being affected, and having flexible dollars to deal with the problems is much better than having restrictions. We have to look at rainy day fund, and then we have to consider where all these increasing demands that we're facing. So in terms of what the budget's going to look like, this is a projection. These are kind of some of the things we've heard from talking to folks. So there's not a ton of strict rules in the Constitution about the budget process. It just says that there be one, and then the governor has veto power. So the one idea is to do a 1/12 budget, which is usually what happens when the legislature doesn't finish by July 1st. They usually do an extension of the prior year's funding just for a month to allow them to negotiate and figure it out. So doing a 1/12, like further into fiscal 21, is one option, where they're just kind of doing it as they go. And that could buy you some time. The problem is you're also, it doesn't really allow you to increase money to anything. It doesn't really allow you to create a real targeted budget. It's sort of just extending what we did in fiscal 20. And one of the challenges with that too is that we simply, at least as of now, we don't have as much revenue as we did, as we planned to in FY20. And so you can't, if you're running a deficit and you do a 1/12, you're running higher than the revenue that you have. So that's a real challenge. And there's also things we know cost more. So I'm focused on this a lot, but we're supposed to do this K-12 funding reform. That means we're adding more money to the system. If you do a 1/12, you're not. So there's some challenges with that. There's some talk of doing something like where you do a budget for 3 or 4 months, which would mean that you're not you don't have to come to the budget every single month, but it still has issues of how do you plan for that, and there's still going to be kind of information coming in and this is true of like anything that's really, most programs plan on having a solid number for a year, but if you have 3 months and you're not sure what's going to happen after that, it definitely is going to be a challenge to do the planning that you would normally do. So as I mentioned, the hits that we are taking, that we're projected to take right now in the 20 and 21 budgets are, very massive. I mean, we're talking 10, 15% revenue hits. And as of now, again, the things in sort of the positive column, like the rainy day fund, are not at the scale to fill that gap. And so as we wrap up fiscal 20, there is the possibility that, what typically happens is if we're in a deficit is that the governor has to do line item based cuts called 9Cs to balance the budget, because again, the state has to balance its budget. But that's kind of tough to do now because we're in May and, there's not that much left of FY20. So we'll see how that goes. We may that may happen or may not, and the governor can cut from anything that's sort of under his jurisdiction. And like I said, the variable here, a variable that would allow us to get to balance here, get us out of this hole, would be the federal relief, but that's kind of an evolving situation. So I'm saying a little bit more about the details of what we've gotten so far from the feds, and then what we can hope for in the future. So there's been so far there's been 4 coronavirus relief bills. One was kind of called 3.5, which is kind of trying to keep straight the terminology can be a little difficult, but the one that's just being proposed this week would be the 5th coronavirus response bill, and it's too early to say. We know what the proposal would cost because the House Democrats released that, but it's a long way to being finished. So the first coronavirus relief bill wasn't too much for the state budget. The second one was a little, over $1 billion to help Medicaid, to help cover coronavirus-related things, and to expand coverage for children. So that was significant. Where I think the goal is all testing and treatment for coronavirus be free. So then, as I mentioned, there was the third coronavirus relief bill called CARES. Did have a bunch of different types of money flowing in the state budget and was more tuned to responding to the economic and policy areas that we needed. And you can see I just have a grid here that lists what some of these funds were. I think it was a pretty big number in terms of how much was coming in these different funds. But as you can see in the right column, there's a lot of different strings and conditions on certain money. So there was about a $2.7 billion state and local budget fund. However, there was a limitation around using it only for direct response to coronavirus. And then some of it was going to go to large counties and cities, and some of it was going to go to the state budget. And we're still kind of waiting for what all the regulations and rules about how that money can be used. And then there was a bunch of other money that actually didn't go to the state budget, but went to specific targeted things. So there was $1 billion for the T, which is great because T ridership has gone off a cliff. There was money for school districts and higher education that went right to districts and universities, which is good, but that didn't solve the state budget problem. So there were these pots of money in the third relief bill, but there was more restrictions and red tape. I think one of the things that didn't have as much red tape was the $46 million that Titus mentioned for child care block grants that just goes into the budget to support daycare. So big picture, this is a very difficult time, but we have to kind of think about, what can state and local and federal government do? And one thing we don't want to do is, get our state and our cities and the federal government into an austerity mode, because this is just the time when we need the government to spend, to keep people hired, to keep sectors like childcare afloat. So we need to kind of think about, okay, we do have this big hole that we're looking at, but how do we find the revenue we need? So I'll say a little bit. I won't go into too much detail on this, but here's a couple of things that we're thinking about. So the state was going to do a charitable deduction. So for people who, usually people take standard deduction and they don't deduct charity anymore, but there are people who itemize and get write-offs for their charitable donations. So that was going to be a $300 million hit to the budget. That was before COVID-19, so it's hard to tell what the estimate is now, but even Governor Baker was talking about maybe looking at this and adjusting it because this chart basically shows that over half of the benefit of this tax break goes to those making over $1 million, and over 70% of it goes to people between upwards 200,000 or more. So this is something that was going to be a hit to the budget. That is our own policy choice that is really regressive in terms of who it goes to. And those are just the type of things we need to kind of look at and review right now because we need every dollar we can get. So I think that there's a number of things we have to keep in mind as far as what we can do on the corporate taxation side. I think that there is definitely some companies that are going to be in real trouble now, but there's also other companies that are writing this out fine, or think about Amazon or any of the delivery companies. They're actually doing a lot of business right now, or more business, and so Target and stuff like that. So there are companies that are doing pretty well, and so we can look at stuff on the corporate tax side. So there's a number of things that happened when they did the federal tax cut in 2017. The long story short about that, it was extremely regressive. It was tons of tax cuts for wealthy and corporations, and it was so costly over the next 10 years. I think it was adding like about $2 trillion to the deficit, that there was some things put in to try to make up some of that revenue. And Massachusetts has the option to tap into some of those things. One of them is called GILTI, which is basically when companies move money from the U.S. to tax havens like the Cayman Islands and stuff like that. You can, there's rules about taxing that income. We could tax more of that, and that would be in the, $400 to $500 million per year range before all this happened. There's a rule for businesses writing down their interest on their taxes. There's a tax break called the single sales factor, which is basically was supposed to help manufacturing. It has had no effect on manufacturing, and is pretty costly as well. I think it's 100 to 200 million. I know there's different people who feel differently about this one. There's the film tax credit, where we have a very, very generous refundable tax credit to people who make movies and commercials and TV shows in Massachusetts. And for a long time, we've really pointed out that we love movies and stuff being made in Massachusetts, but the value of the tax break compared to the economic activity that's creating is a real mismatch, and a lot of that money goes to out-of-state folks who can also sort of sell those to other people. So, and there are potentially, it's a little bit more complicated, but companies that are doing a lot of business more than they used to be doing, we could look at taxes on some of those windfall profits. So,
Colin, I have one quick question that
Yes.
came in. Does the charity review include considering pilots payment in lieu of tax for non-profit agencies? I'm thinking that Kathleen might have been thinking of big colleges or hospitals or other entities.
Yeah, so the pilot thing is interesting. So in normal times, the challenge with pilots is it's always going to be, unless you change like state and federal nonprofit law, it's always going to be a voluntary payment that you're asking for from exempt agencies like hospitals and universities and stuff like that. So it's something that has sort of a mixed record, and then usually the amount of money we're talking about is very small. And again, unless you change the state and federal 501c3 rules, which is sort of a long shot, it's always going to be voluntary. And so it's something we can look at, but it's also, the other thing is that both of those types of institutions like hospitals and universities are also facing major revenue issues right now. So I think that makes it even more challenging. So like, this is a whole nother topic, but we have to figure out what's going to happen when all of higher education goes remote, because are people going to, like, it's a sort of a wild card. Like, are people going to not enroll at UMass and maybe do community college because it's cheaper and everything's remote anyway? Will they go from private schools back to UMass? Or so there's some variables with higher ed finance, which already had some challenges across that sector before all of this. So I would say pilots is kind of a challenge right now.
Great.
One last thing, I mean, we still have the policy agenda in our tax policy agenda that we've been talking about for a long time. And one of the things that we were going to do before all this happened, and we're still pushing forward on, is the fair share amendment or the millionaire's tax on income over $1 million. And before all this craziness was happening, we were expecting about $2 billion a year if this passed. Obviously, with the recession, there's less people making that much money, but there still are people making that. But it would, we would expect that revenue to go down. But it already passed once in the legislature and constitutional convention, and it will probably go through again. And that's something that could be, on the ballot in 2022 and then start to take effect in 2023. So obviously less people are making $1 million or more. There still are people who are, and it's still a good tax policy to ask for more from those folks. So with that, I'm done with my slides, and I think I made it close to 20 minutes. So happy to open it up now.
Thanks, Colin. That was terrific. So I'm actually going to switch my slides back on. Keep your questions coming and we can answer them as we go. We just want to share a few updates before we run out of time. And I know time is very precious, so we'll kind of shift the order here, and we'll do, unless you have a very specific question for Colin right now, I'll jump in with, oh, actually there was a question that I missed. Sorry, this is actually a very important one. It was in the chat. Colin, how can EEC adjust its budget against the lost revenues that the state is faced with? And what's a follow-up is, what services could be switched out from other areas to support early childhood programs?
That's a good question. So I think, I think you are all aware that the early ed budget in Massachusetts is, very tight, is very low compared to what our costs of care are. And I wish I could say that there's big areas that we think will be freed up, but as long as the state continues to pay subsidies and even pays family fees, which is something they don't normally cover, I mean, there's not obvious pots of money that aren't being utilized in the EEC budget that could be moved around. I think that's something that we should look for where we can. I think that we should be, more looking at what's coming on the plus side of relief. I mean, I think there's proposals out there. One thing that I've already determined in looking at the most recent federal bill that's coming out this week is that the amount of dedicated funding for childcare is still relatively small. Titus, correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's about $7 billion for childcare block grants in a $3 trillion bill, or so 7 out of 3,000 is is childcare. So there's still a challenge there. One thing that we can look forward to is that at least the way that the House Democrats wrote it, the state and local government aid, which I would presume would be more flexible than it was in the last round, is something like 5 or 6 times greater. So if all of a sudden we get $10+ billion in fiscal relief, then everything looks a lot more favorable. If we don't, then I think we kind of have to prepare for that. But that's kind of worst case scenario where, we are taking multiple, $4+ billion hits, and we have to start, things to get pretty dicey. And then that won't allow us to do the things we need to do in terms of the rescue package to centers and providers. So I think it is the downside, or sort of pessimistic scenario is really bad. I think we have to be prepared for it, or at least ready for the idea that there may not be like specific programs, or you may have to use a big chunk of our state and local relief to work on childcare.
Thanks. And I know that we're aware that 45 or so million is in the CARES Act, which is good, but I think I heard the statistic that monthly the sector loses 250 million due to the loss of private pay. So private paying families, and the state contributing the parent fee is great, but possibly not sustainable forever, right? Because it's an added cost that it wasn't paying before for the programs who are closed. We did hear some talk about potentially a state match for the federal CARES Act money. I'm not quite sure if that's advanced yet, but it is one scenario where we could maybe get some more funding to match the, what the CARES Act provided, just to account for the need. I think the big picture message I would like to share, though, with everyone is that this is a work in progress, but your role as advocates is more critical than ever. We have sent a sign-on letter to the Reopening Advisory Board, and the message is this top bullet here that you see. Early education and care is critical to any reopening of our economy, and no recovery will be successful if employees and working families do not have access to safe, affordable, high-quality childcare for their children. Program directors, many of you are on this call, you are thinking about this, you're thinking about how to, do right by your employees, by your families, by your children. We want you to be telling your story to the elected officials at the local, state, and federal level. Now is the time to act and communicate and share your story. It makes a big difference when a legislator has data or an anecdote or a personal connection to the sector that we're all advocating for and trying to support. We've put some links here. I will send that in the follow-up. You'll be able to click on that link, but you can go to the Secretary of State's website to look at our congressional delegation. They're all in support of this issue. Senator Warren and Representative Clark specifically both have proposals at the federal level to invest much more in childcare. Now we'll see how far they get, but again, it will be more likely that those proposals are taken seriously if the whole delegation is hearing from people in their constituency. So look up, make sure you know who your U.S. congressperson is on the House side, and make sure you're in touch with Senator Markey's office as well as Senator Warren's office. The Massachusetts legislature is sort of the same story. Decisions are going to be made over the next couple of months, as you've heard Charlie and Colin both allude to. They need to know what your needs are, and we are sharing them on behalf of the early education and care field. But find some time, pick up the phone, and call your state senator and state rep, and let them know. If you're a parent and you're working from home, and that's unsustainable with small children, and you want to go back to work, but your center isn't sure how it will be reopening. Let them know your situation. If you're a director or a family child care home, share that data as well. What the closure has meant to you, how you're continuing to do remote services, emergency services, distance learning, and all of those other great creative things that you're doing. Let them know about that, and let them know that you are there, and that we all could use the support of the elected officials. You can, of course, bookmark our Strategies for Children website, strategiesforchildren.org. There's a state budget tab. That's what that link goes to. And we will be updating it as soon as we hear something from the State House around the House budget, or any of the other potential scenarios Colin and Charlie mentioned. You can sign up for our email updates. And if you have a question that you think of tomorrow or the next day, just send me an email, info@strategiesforchildren.org. So there are lots of ways to get involved, and we think the more voices that are shared from this field and from families with young children, the more stories and voices and data that are shared up to the elected officials, the better we'll be in these, difficult budget choices that have to be made. So are there any questions at this point that anyone has for Charlie or for Colin? I think I saw one more in the chat. someone mentioned that the National Chamber of Commerce may be a resource. Yes, there's a Chamber of Commerce nationally with a foundation that is very focused on childcare as one of its issue areas. And there are businesses in Massachusetts that are paying attention to childcare in ways that they never had before. So we see this as another opportunity to engage business leaders, employers, business groups, chambers of commerce all around the state. We're sort of at the early stages of that. We did some great work last month with the law firm Goodwin, who were able to offer a free technical assistance webinar for childcare directors. And we are in touch with the Mass Business Roundtable and Eastern Bank, PNC Bank. There are several business-oriented groups that are interested in this issue. And their voices will be key for the advocacy that's needed. So please engage them at the local level or at the state level.
One thing I wanted to get in there in terms of some of the scenarios to expect, and I should have mentioned this earlier. So it's definitely not going to proceed in a normal way where the House works on their budget separately and the Senate works on their budget separately. We've kind of blown through the normal deadlines. So what we can probably expect is that the two sides will sort of collapse their budget process into one and kind of work together and try to, it isn't going to be kind of, I mean, typically they'd be like, oh, I want these priorities. There'd be a lot of horse trading and stuff. I just think it's just such a kind of urgent situation that they're going to try to just basically collapse that into one process. I think that we're almost at May 15th, so we're almost at when we would normally expect the Senate budget to be done. One of the challenges with this is that, you know, the cities and towns, particularly, and school districts and a bunch of others, they're going to need to get a budget numbers of some kind. They could be grim numbers, but they're going to need to get some numbers of some kind at the city level. Like when you look at Chapter 78, local aid, they're going to need some numbers to work from to figure out what they're going to do. So I think that I don't think they're going to be able to, like, they're going to have to come up with something relatively soon, even if it's on the sort of more pessimistic side, just so that cities and school districts and can budget. And so I think that it may be it's a little bit of a black box right now in terms of they're trying to figure out what it's going to look like. But if they don't act pretty soon, like, and I think Charlie referenced this, that some of the rules about when cities have to file their budgets and their procedures, like town meeting, have been waived. But there comes a certain point where we'll need that to be figured out, and so it may come faster than folks might expect.
Thanks, Colin. Charlie, did you have anything to add?
The only piece I think I'd just like to emphasize the last couple of pieces that Titus talked about around advocacy. This issue is absolutely front and center. The reopening of the economy is dependent upon figuring this piece out. And when the budget in Massachusetts lands for a vote is sort of too late. I would say we're at the here and now. We've got sort of a sympathetic ear on this issue, and speaking out now is the time to act and have some impact.
Yeah, one quick thing about that. I think it's been pretty obvious that if there was the presentation from the governor either yesterday or the day before that looked at sort of what are the steps and benchmarks he's looking for in terms of different activity opening up. But it's sort of a red flashing light that we're starting to reopen May 18th, according to the original timeline, but childcare is still closed through June 29th with the exception of emergency programs. So squaring that circle is going to be key to everything, because if you're opening businesses yet people have nowhere for their kids, it's just not going to work. And so I definitely agree that we have to focus on the fact that this is a critical part of reopening the economy. And I think that maybe there aren't so many people on the opening advisory board that have kids under 5, but they need to hear from people who do.
Thanks. And we've seen some great letters from directors, from our coalition, our statewide coalition of advocates, just calling for those precautions. The programs themselves are worried about health and safety first and foremost. So they need potentially extra funding to implement, new protocols around cleaning, disinfecting, and plus there's social distancing, and how do you do that if you haven't done it before? I think the emergency childcare programs have done some great, heroic, innovative work to keep childcare safe and healthy, but also developmentally appropriate during this time. So we're probably going to have to learn from those folks. And but the EEC is aware of all this and trying to figure out ways to develop the reopening plan, communicate it with programs so that programs can communicate it with staff and families. There will be a cost, though, for sure. I mean, it's not like we can all just reopen for the same budget, the same budget that we had, going into this.
Yeah, I know I'm preaching at the choir here, but I think we've seen some initial reports from the emergency program that the rates simply aren't high enough. And, if you think about it, if you're going to open programs, you have fewer kids, you need more equipment, you need more protective gear and sanitizer and stuff. It's going to take more, and we don't really have the muscle memory because rates have been so low for so long. But we absolutely, at least starting with the emergency program and then really everything going forward, need to jump up those rates to reflect the fact that we may not have the same enrollment, and also the fact that we need smaller class sizes. So I think that's something we should push for, especially because with something like the emergency program, I think, and this depends on how it is rolled out, but the budget relief that we already have is limited to COVID-19, but the emergency program is specific to COVID-19. So we should be able to use some of that money to jack up those rates. And there's been just that initial report from the Globe, which I have to follow up on, about centers being paid below their regular rates, even though it's more difficult, which is the exact opposite of what we should be doing.
Exactly. So more to come. Again, strategiesforchildren.org, massbudget.org. We will be sending out the slides later this week. And the time, as Charlie said, the time is now to call your elected officials, let them know who you are, let them know your child care story specifically. And there will be more ways to weigh in and advocate through letters, calls, and other activities over the next month. I think we'll close for now. And just want to thank everyone again for your time. This has been great. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, we'll close. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you.